Chapter 1. The Harvest Fair at Willowbrook. Willowbrook was a small and very pretty place, though the villagers would have been shocked to hear it described so. To them it was simply home. The narrow high street with its crooked signposts, the mellow stone cottages with roses clambering over their doorways, and the low-arched bridge where ducks dabbled in the stream. It was not a village that sought notice from the world beyond. The great event of the year, to those who lived there, was the Harvest Fair. Held in the grounds of Willowbrook Hall, it was both social highlight and charitable duty. The sale of jams and preserves, a contest of vegetables, a tombola to benefit the church roof, and most anticipated of all, the recipe competition. Every housewife in the parish had her pride bound up in cakes, puddings, or preserves, and the air was thick with both the scent of cinnamon and the sharper spice of rivalry. It was a particularly fine day that year, crisp, bright, and golden. The lawn was dotted with stalls, bunting fluttered from the hedges, and the brass band from Marleycombe struck up a tune that was only slightly less out of key than usual. Children ran shrieking from the coconut shy, dogs barked, and everywhere the smell of baking drifted on the air. Miss Jane Marple of St. Mary Mead had come down for the occasion at the invitation of an old friend, Mrs. Wetherill, a redoubtable woman who chaired the harvest committee with the air of a general commanding troops. Miss Marple, in her small straw hat and neatly pressed jacket, moved quietly among the stalls, accepting cups of tea, praising sponge cakes with gentle tact, and observing with her sharp, bright eyes. She looked, to all who noticed her, a kindly elderly lady of little consequence, but her gaze, for all its mildness, missed very little. It was during the judging of the recipe competition that the first shadow fell. The entries had been set out with great ceremony in the marquee, pies gleaming under their golden crusts, jars of chutney and jam with ribbons about their necks, and cakes standing proudly on glass stands. The judges, the vicar's wife, the doctor's sister, and the formidable Mrs. Wetherill herself, moved slowly along the table, spoons in hand. The excitement reached its height when the final entry was uncovered, a dense, richly scented fruit cake submitted by Mrs. Emery, the grocer's wife. There was a murmur of appreciation, followed by expectant silence as Mrs. Wetherill cut a slice and took a delicate taste. It was at that precise moment that the silence broke. Mrs. Emery herself, standing modestly at the back, gave a sudden, strangled cry. She lurched forward, her hands clutching at the tablecloth. The cake knife clattered to the ground, and before anyone could do more than gasp, she collapsed heavily to the floor of the marquee. There was instant pandemonium. Women shrieked, chairs were overturned, and the doctor, hurried forward by a dozen, urging hands, bent swiftly over her. "Fetch water! Fetch brandy!" cried Mrs. Wetherill, pale and shaken, but still in command. Miss Marple did not move in the confusion. She stood very still, her eyes resting, not on the stricken woman, but on the table where the cakes stood. For in the moment of collapse she had noticed something curious. A small, leather-bound notebook, half tucked beneath the plate of fruit cake. Its cover was scuffed, its pages yellowed, and upon its open leaf, visible for only an instant before the cloth shifted, there were words in a spidery hand. "Last page of the recipe book." The doctor looked up gravely. "She is gone," he said quietly. "Mrs. Emery is dead." Gasps broke out afresh. A woman dead, in the midst of the harvest fair. Miss Marple closed her eyes briefly. She had seen death before, sudden and quiet, in war, in sickness, in murder. When she opened them again, her gaze went once more to the half-hidden notebook. No one else had noticed. The crowd pressed round the body, whispering and weeping. The police would be sent for, questions asked, blame apportioned. But Miss Marple, with her knowledge of human nature and her eye for the overlooked, had already marked the curious presence of that book, and the odd coincidence of its words. "Dear me," she murmured softly. "The last page, indeed." Chapter 2. Whispers after the fair. The harvest fair ended not with music and merriment, but with stunned silence. Villagers drifted home in uneasy groups, murmuring together, glancing over their shoulders as though the familiar hedgerows and thatched roofs might suddenly conceal menace. The brass band, awkwardly, had attempted to play again, but the sound faltered and died. By evening the news had spread beyond Willowbrook. From Marleycombe to St. Mary Mead, from farms and fields to back kitchens, everyone knew that Mrs. Emery, the grocer's wife, had fallen dead in the midst of the competition. And everyone, in true village fashion, had a theory. At the Green Man, the public house on the High Street, the theories came thick and fast. "Apoplexy," declared Mr. Barnes, the landlord, pulling a pint with conviction. "She was stout, wasn't she? A stout woman, full of good dinners, bound to burst a vessel one day." "Poison," contradicted the blacksmith, lowering his voice. "It's always poison in these cases. And what better place than a recipe contest? Mark my words, there was arsenic in that cake." In the post office, Miss Prowse, the postmistress, leaned over the counter with relish. "I heard the doctor himself say it was unnatural. And you may depend on it, she had enemies. A woman who keeps the shop always has enemies, over the weight of butter or the price of tea." Miss Marple, for her part, listened and smiled with gentle politeness. She sat that morning in the tea-room with Mrs. Wetherill, who was pale but determined to recount every detail of the tragedy. "Collapsed at my very feet, Jane," she exclaimed, stirring her tea with unnecessary vigor. "And the look upon her face. Well, I shall never forget it. Shock, certainly. But something else. Almost as if she had realized something." Miss Marple nodded, her blue eyes thoughtful. "And no doubt the villagers have been busy since with their speculations?" "My dear, the whole village is in an uproar. Some say it was her husband, though poor Mr. Emery looks quite dazed. Others say it was a quarrel over recipes. Silly, of course, but you know how people are." "Yes," said Miss Marple softly. "I do indeed." She sipped her tea, recalling in her mind that glimpse of the notebook, the old leather cover, the faded script, the curious phrase about the last page of the recipe book. It was not in Mrs. Emery's handwriting, of that she was quite certain. And why should such a book have been placed there, half hidden, beneath her own entry? By afternoon the police had arrived from Marleycombe. Inspector Graves, a sturdy man with brisk manners, not without a sense of his own importance. He spoke firmly to the gathered crowd in the square. "Mrs. Emery's death will be fully investigated. Until we have the results of the doctor's examination, we must not leap to conclusions. But I shall say this: the circumstances are suspicious. Very suspicious indeed." This pronouncement satisfied everyone, for it justified their excitement. Suspicion is far more diverting than apoplexy. Miss Marple walked home slowly with Mrs. Wetherill, observing the small details others missed. Mrs. Emery's daughter, pale and tearful, avoiding the eye of a certain young man by the baker's stall. The vicar's wife whispering urgently to Dr. Graham. The way Mr. Emery himself stared at the ground, not in grief but in bewilderment, as though something did not quite add up in his own mind. When she reached her guest room in Mrs. Wetherill's house, Miss Marple sat down with a small notepad she always carried. She wrote in her neat script, "Mrs. Emery dead. Sudden collapse. Unnatural. Recipe competition. Her public stage notebook. Old leather spidery hand. Last page of recipe book. Daughter avoiding young man. Romantic trouble. Mr. Emery dazed. Not grief-stricken quarrels over shop accounts." She laid down her pen and folded her hands. Death at a village fete or fair, she reflected, was never so simple as it seemed. Behind the chatter of recipes and the bustle of jam stalls, there were secrets, old rivalries, wounded pride, resentments tucked away like dried herbs in a cupboard, and it was often in such small, homely settings that the darkest things took root. Chapter 3. Early Clues. Inspector Graves was quick to establish himself in Willowbrook. By the morning after the fair, he had commandeered a room in the village hall, placed a constable at the door, and summoned all who had been near the marquee for questioning. His manner was brisk and official, and he liked very much to remind people that he had handled worse than this in Marleycombe. The villagers, for their part, enjoyed it thoroughly. To be questioned gave one a certain importance, and each person emerged from the hall with an air of mystery, dropping hints of what they had said, or nearly said, or dared not say. Miss Marple, seated quietly in Mrs. Wetherell's parlour with her knitting, did not hurry to be questioned. She knew well enough that officialdom was often blinded by its own energy. What mattered were the things said carelessly in kitchens and gardens. She heard first from Mrs. Price, who kept hens at the edge of the village. "Strange business, Miss Marple. I heard Mrs. Emery had been copying down new recipes only last week, writing in an old book of hers. And now they say the very book was found beside her cake, though why she would bring it to the fair I cannot imagine. Unless," Mrs. Price lowered her voice, "she meant to show it to someone in particular." Miss Marple nodded politely. Yes, that would be odd indeed. Later that morning she strolled down to the grocer's shop. Mr. Emery was behind the counter, pale and distracted, weighing out sugar with a hand that trembled slightly. "Such a terrible loss," Miss Marple said gently. He looked up, startled, and blinked. Yes, terrible. I don't rightly understand it. She was well that morning, lively even, and then to fall like that, in front of everyone." He broke off, shaking his head. Miss Marple hesitated, then asked with apparent innocence, "Did she often use the recipe book?" He frowned. "Book? No, not really. She kept her notes here and there, scraps of paper. I don't recall her ever carrying one about." "Why?" "Oh, nothing," said Miss Marple softly. "I had thought I glimpsed something on the table." He nodded vaguely, already turning to another customer. But Miss Marple, who never missed the tone of a voice, marked the bewilderment in his. A husband may be stricken by grief, but when he is puzzled, that is quite another thing. By afternoon, Miss Marple made a small expedition to the churchyard. She liked the peace there, and it gave her an excuse to pass the vicarage. The vicar's wife, seeing her, hurried out with a whisper. "My dear Miss Marple, it is most peculiar. Dr. Graham tells me Mrs. Emery had traces of digitalis in her system. Not a natural cause at all. And do you know, the doctor himself prescribed it. For a patient with a weak heart, not for her. Imagine, someone must have slipped it into her food." "Digitalis," repeated Miss Marple mildly. "So very effective, and so very difficult to trace if one is not looking." "Yes, and the inspector is quite convinced it was deliberate. But who, Miss Marple, who could possibly have done such a dreadful thing?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly. "In my experience, my dear, people are often poisoned not by strangers, but by those who know precisely what they will eat, and when." That evening, in the quiet of her room, Miss Marple set down her notes once more. "Digitalis confirmed, book on table. Unusual for Mrs. Emery. Husband surprised. Mrs. Price saw her writing in it last week. Perhaps not her book at all. Daughter avoiding young man. Puzzled husband. Not conspirator, but kept in dark." She paused, her pen hovering, then added, "Recipe book may not be hers. Placed deliberately? To point, or to warn." She folded the paper carefully. Murder was always shocking, but rarely mysterious once one understood human nature. Somewhere in Willowbrook, among the jam jars and hymn singing, lay envy, resentment, or fear, the true ingredients of the recipe. Miss Marple, smiling faintly, thought to herself, "It is the last page one must always read most carefully." Chapter 4. The Wrong Suspect. Inspector Graves prided himself on being a man of action. By the third day he had taken statements from half the village, paced the length of the high street a dozen times, and made up his mind. At noon he stood squarely in the grocer's shop and announced, in a voice meant to carry through the shelves of tinned sardines and barley sugar, "Mr. Emery, I must ask you to accompany me to the hall. There are matters to be explained concerning your late wife's death." The villagers gasped. It was just what they had expected, and exactly what they had hoped to hear. A husband, of course. It was always the husband. Poor Mr. Emery stood gaping, the scoop of flour still in his hand. Me? But I loved her. I wouldn't. Graves's tone was firm. The doctor's report shows digitalis. Digitalis was kept in your house, prescribed for your wife's cousin, Mrs. Green. We have found the bottle, and your wife had no ailment requiring it. How do you explain that? Mr. Emery stammered, turned pale, and swayed on his feet. The constable laid a steadying hand upon his arm, and the little crowd that had gathered outside whispered excitedly, already convinced of his guilt. Miss Marple, who had happened to be passing at that very moment, and she did have a knack for such moments, came forward quietly. Forgive me, Inspector, but surely it is just as likely that anyone in the household might have handled that bottle. Servants. Relations. Graves gave a curt nod. We shall consider all possibilities, Miss Marple. But opportunity lies chiefly with the husband. And opportunity, as you well know, is half of guilt. Miss Marple's eyes were mild. Yes, Inspector, but motive is the other half, and I cannot quite imagine what poor Mr. Emery has to gain by such a deed. His grief looks real, but more than that, his bewilderment does too. Graves harumphed, unconvinced, and marched his suspect away. That afternoon, Willowbrook buzzed with certainty. In the tea-room, Mrs. Price declared, I always said she kept him under her thumb. Small wonder he snapped. At the Green Man, Mr. Barnes opined that men do these things when there's another woman in it, and by evening most of the village was persuaded that Mr. Emery would soon be in jail. Miss Marple, however, sat serenely with her knitting, her thoughts very far from conviction. She had noticed 3 small things the inspector had overlooked. First, Mrs. Emery had collapsed at the very moment the fruit-cake was cut, before she had even tasted it. Second, the recipe book, half hidden, bore handwriting quite unlike hers, narrow, spidery, foreign-looking, as though written by someone who had learned penmanship in another hand entirely. And third, the puzzled, almost affronted look upon Mr. Emery's face. Not a guilty man fearing discovery, but an honest one who felt the world had suddenly shifted beneath his feet. That evening Miss Marple wrote upon her notepaper, Inspector arrests husband. Too simple. Timing, collapse before cake eaten. Poison elsewhere. Recipe book not hers, planted. Mr. Emery bewildered, not complicit bottle in house. Opportunity for many, not only husband, and beneath it, in her fine script. Too obvious. Always beware the obvious. She folded the paper neatly. Human nature, Miss Marple reflected, was much like baking. If one added too much spice, it spoiled the flavor. If one presented a solution too neatly, it was sure to be wrong. And in Willowbrook, the recipe was far from complete. Chapter 5. Secrets Revealed. Inspector Graves's arrest of poor Mr. Emery did not quiet Willowbrook as he hoped. On the contrary, it fanned gossip into a blaze. And gossip, Miss Marple knew, is like smoke. Once it rises, it clings to curtains, clothes, and reputations, and is very difficult to drive away. The village had never seemed so divided. Some shook their heads in pity over Mr. Emery's plight. Others whispered with relish that he was a sly one all along. But in every cottage and shop new tales emerged of Mrs. Emery herself, tales that hinted she was not quite the blameless grocer's wife most had thought. Mrs. Price, the henkeeper, confided over tea, Did you know, Miss Marple, she was forever arguing with Mrs. Green about that cousin's prescription? Mrs. Green said she needed more drops than the doctor allowed, but Mrs. Emery stood firm. It caused bitter words, I can tell you. At the tea-room, Miss Prowse leaned forward, lowering her voice. There was also the matter of the accounts. Mrs. Emery kept the books for the shop. Too carefully, some say. A neighbor told me she had found shortages, and more than once money went missing. Imagine. A grocer's wife accused of dishonesty. Even Mrs. Wetherill, solid and reliable, had her piece to add. My dear Jane, I dislike saying so, but Mrs. Emery had a very particular friendship with Mr. Harcourt, the baker. Late-night discussions about recipes, they said. Too late, if you take my meaning. Miss Marple listened with the patience of a woman knitting a long, slow pattern. She neither agreed nor contradicted, but her bright eyes missed none of the little sparks that flickered behind each revelation: envy, rivalry, and in some cases, satisfaction. That afternoon she walked through the village, stopping here and there under pretext of shopping. At the grocer's she observed the daughter, Ellen, pale and tired, slipping coins into the till with a trembling hand. Miss Marple noticed, too, the way young Tom Harcourt, the baker's son, lingered by the door, casting anxious glances toward Ellen and then quickly away. In such glances, Miss Marple reflected, whole tragedies were often written. By evening, Dr. Graham himself stopped by Mrs. Wetherell's cottage, his manner grave. "I hardly like to say so, Miss Marple, but Mrs. Emery consulted me not long ago, not for herself, for her daughter. Ellen has been fainting of late. Nothing serious, only nervous trouble, but the mother was most insistent I keep it discreet. She feared gossip. I cannot help but wonder now if that secrecy has something to do with this dreadful business." Miss Marple thanked him kindly, but her mind was already weaving threads together. Quarrel with Mrs. Green, digitalis dispute, accounts in question, money missing friendship with Baker, too close, daughter Ellen, plus Tom Harcourt, romance concealed mother anxious to hush it. She tapped her pencil against her notes and added, too many motives, which one true? That night, as she prepared for bed, Miss Marple stood a moment at the window. Willowbrook lay quiet under the harvest moon, the cottages drowsing, the stream silvered, the hedges still. But she knew well enough that beneath those roofs hearts beat with fear, guilt, or envy. And somewhere among them was a hand that had turned the last page of a recipe book and written death into it. Chapter 6. The Twist in the Kitchen. For 2 days the village simmered with secrets and suspicion. Inspector Graves grew ever more confident in his case against Mr. Emery, declaring loudly in the Green Man that a husband always has both opportunity and motive. But gossip, like a pot left untended, soon boiled over again. It began in the kitchens of Willowbrook Hall, where Mrs. Green, the cousin for whom digitalis had been prescribed, worked as housekeeper. On the 3rd evening after the fair, she was found slumped across the scrubbed pine table, her teacup overturned beside her. At first the maids thought she had fainted, but when Dr. Graham arrived, summoned in haste, his face grew grim. "Another dose of digitalis," he pronounced. "Not enough to kill her, but enough to make her very ill. Someone meant to silence her, just as they silenced Mrs. Emery." The news spread like wildfire. If there had been doubt before, there was none now. Something far darker than a quarrel or a kitchen accident was at work in Willowbrook. Inspector Graves, however, remained obstinate. "It proves my case," he declared. "Mrs. Green was the source of the medicine. Mr. Emery feared she would speak out, and so he tried to silence her too." But Miss Marple, who had gone quietly to visit the stricken woman the following morning, was not persuaded. She sat beside Mrs. Green's bed, smoothing the coverlet with her gloved hand, and asked softly, "Tell me, my dear, did you speak with Mrs. Emery on the day of the fair?" Mrs. Green's eyes fluttered. "Yes. She asked about the bottle. She knew I sometimes begged for more drops. She said she must write it down, to keep account. I told her no, it was between us. She said the book would keep it safe." Miss Marple's eyes brightened faintly. "Ah, the book." That afternoon she returned to the marquee where the competition had been held. It was quiet now, the bunting sagging, the tables cleared. But Miss Marple, with her habit of seeing what others missed, bent to examine the corner where the cakes had stood. There, half hidden beneath the leg of a trestle, she found a torn scrap of paper. The writing was the same spidery hand she had glimpsed in the notebook, and the words, though incomplete, were enough to chill. "He will ruin everything if the last page is found." Miss Marple tucked it carefully into her reticule. That evening, as she sat with her knitting, she added a new page to her notes. "Mrs. Green poisoned, not fatal. Attempt at silence. She mentions Mrs. Emery writing in the book. Scrap found. Ruin everything if last page is found. Book not a recipe book at all. Disguise for something else. She paused, then added in her neat hand, the book is the key. Someone will kill to keep its last page hidden. Miss Marple looked out of the window. The village lay peaceful in the dusk, children calling in the lane, lamps glowing in cottage windows. But she knew the peace was an illusion. A secret was buried in Willowbrook, a secret written on the last page of a recipe book, and until it was found, more lives might yet be lost. Chapter 7. Suspicion Shifts. Willowbrook did not rest easily after the second poisoning. Mrs. Green, pale but recovering, lay in her bed at the Hall, attended by fluttering maids who carried stories back and forth with every tray of broth. Each story grew larger in the telling, until it seemed half the village had a hand in Mrs. Emery's death. The arrest of Mr. Emery no longer satisfied. If his wife had been poisoned, and Mrs. Green nearly silenced too, then perhaps, whispered the villagers, the grocer was not the man after all. A husband might act in a moment of rage, but 2 attempts, so carefully planned, spoke of calculation, and that suggested another hand. At the Green Man, speculation now turned toward the Harcourts, the bakers. I always said Mrs. Emery was too friendly with Mr. Harcourt, declared Mrs. Price, wagging her finger. All those late-night talks about dough and yeast, nonsense I call it. And she helped his son with the accounts, added Miss Prowse from the post office. Ellen Emery and young Tom Harcourt, thick as thieves they were. What if there was money missing, or worse? Miss Marple, seated that afternoon with Mrs. Wetherill, heard still more. My dear Jane, said Mrs. Wetherill, lowering her voice, I've been told that Mrs. Emery kept her own little fund, quite apart from the shop accounts. A secret hoard, tucked away in a book, perhaps. And when women keep secrets from their husbands, there is usually a reason. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. Yes, indeed. And when a woman writes things down, she means them to be remembered, or discovered. Later that day, Miss Marple strolled past the baker's. She paused to admire the loaves cooling in the window, and caught sight of Ellen, the grocer's daughter, speaking hurriedly to Tom Harcourt. Her hands twisted in her apron. His face was anxious. When she saw Miss Marple watching, Ellen turned quickly away. Her cheeks flushed. Miss Marple's eyes softened. Young love was seldom tidy, but in a village where gossip was as quick as fire, it could also be perilous. That evening, Inspector Graves himself called upon Mrs. Wetherill's cottage, where Miss Marple was staying. He looked harassed. Confound it, Miss Marple, I cannot keep up with this village. Every hour brings some new tale, money missing, quarrels, romances. Half the parish had reason to want Mrs. Emery gone. Miss Marple poured him tea and said gently, That is often the way, Inspector. But murder is not born of every little quarrel. It is born of one quarrel in particular, the one most dangerous to expose. Graves frowned. You think this mysterious book has something to do with it? I think, said Miss Marple, that the last page of a recipe book would not be used for soup or sponge cake, but for something quite different. A recipe of another kind altogether. When he had gone, Miss Marple returned to her notes. Rumors of affair. Mrs. Emery plus Mr. Harcourt. Ellen plus Tom. Sadie's secret romance, secret hoard of money. Book as hiding place. Inspector chasing gossip, not pattern. And beneath she wrote, Killer shifts suspicion cleverly. But why so fearful of one missing page? She folded the paper, set aside her knitting, and looked out across Willowbrook. The village lights twinkled softly. The air was cool with autumn scents. Yet behind lace curtains and polished teapots, rivalries and secrets simmered. And Miss Marple, who understood human nature, knew that one of them had already boiled over into murder. Chapter 8. The ledger and the letter Inspector Graves, never one to doubt his own certainty, had fixed his gaze now upon the Harcourts. He marched into the bakery one bright morning, emerging half an hour later with flour dust upon his boots, and a triumphant gleam in his eye. By luncheon he had announced in the Green Man that the baker's boy will answer some questions in Marleycombe. This, of course, delighted the villagers. Gossip requires novelty, and poor Mr. Emery was already yesterday's suspect. "Tom Harcourt, imagine!" cried Miss Prowse at the post office. "He was seen speaking with Ellen Emery, far too often, if you ask me." Mrs. Price sniffed. "And didn't his father owe money on that new oven of his? I dare say Mrs. Emery knew too much." The tale grew larger with each telling. By evening it was all but decided that young Tom would hang. Miss Marple, however, was not convinced. She had seen the frightened devotion in Tom's eyes when Ellen passed by, and devotion seldom leads to poison in teacups. No, that was the work of a cooler, more careful hand. She took herself that afternoon to the vicarage, carrying a jar of Mrs. Wetherell's jam. The vicar's wife, who always had news, greeted her eagerly. "My dear Miss Marple, you will scarcely believe what has come to light. The inspector has obtained one of Mr. Emery's ledgers, and it shows shortages, plain as day, money missing from the shop accounts, but not a word of it written in Mrs. Emery's hand. No, all in someone else's." "Indeed?" said Miss Marple mildly. "And do they know whose?" The vicar's wife lowered her voice. "They say it resembles the writing in that recipe book." Miss Marple's knitting lay still in her lap, spidery, foreign-looking writing, not Mrs. Emery's, but someone who wished it to seem hers. That evening, as she strolled back through the square, a gust of wind blew a scrap of paper against her shoe. She stooped to pick it up, and her eyes narrowed slightly. It was a note, scrawled in that same angular hand. "The page must not be found. Destroy it, or all is lost." She folded it calmly and slipped it into her reticule. Later, in her room, she spread her notes before her. Inspector arrests Tom Harcourt. Romance motive. Tiers too simple. Ledger shows shortages, not in Mrs. Emery's hand. Spidery hand matches recipe book plus new note. Who profits if money missing is blamed on Emery's? Beneath she wrote in neat script, "Pattern of forgery. Book not for recipes, but for accounts. The last page. Type proof." She leaned back, satisfied. People in villages, she thought, often believe the clever ones are those who make the most noise, but it was the quiet ones, the neat-handed, who could move money with a pen and poison with a teaspoon. And it was such neatness, Miss Marple knew, that always left a trace. Chapter 9. The Vanished Pages. The arrest of Tom Harcourt did not still the village tongues. On the contrary, Willowbrook buzzed more feverishly than ever. Some declared he was guilty. Young men are reckless. Love drives them mad. Others swore his innocence. Too simple by half, and besides, he's besotted with Ellen. Miss Marple listened politely, but her thoughts were elsewhere. She had grown certain that the heart of the matter lay not in love affairs or tempers, but in the curious little book that had appeared beside Mrs. Emery's cake. That morning she walked to the grocer's shop under the pretext of buying tea. Ellen Emery was behind the counter, pale as parchment, her hands twisting in her apron. "My dear," Miss Marple said kindly, "you are looking tired. These are hard days for you, I know." Ellen tried to smile. "Thank you, Miss Marple. It's the worry. And now they've taken Tom." Her eyes filled suddenly with tears. "He didn't do it, miss. He couldn't have. He loved Mother too much." Miss Marple's voice was gentle. "Then perhaps you might help me. Did your mother ever keep her recipes in a leather book?" Ellen blinked. "No, never. She had scraps of paper, loose sheets, old envelopes, but not a book. She said books were for those with tidy minds, and she never pretended to be tidy." Miss Marple nodded. "Then the book must have belonged to someone else." The girl hesitated. "I saw it once. Only once. Mr. Jameson had it. He came to see Mother about the accounts. He left it on the counter, and I remember because of the smell. Lavender. Mother said later it was an old account book, not to be touched." "Mr. Jameson?" murmured Miss Marple. "The solicitor's clerk." "Yes, but please, Miss Marple, you mustn't tell the inspector. He will only twist it against us." Miss Marple patted her hand. "We shall see, my dear. We shall see. That afternoon, Miss Marple went calling at the vicarage, and while Mrs. Graves was engaged in lively conversation about the harvest committee, Miss Marple's sharp eyes fell upon the side table where correspondence lay. Among the papers was a small envelope addressed in the spidery hand she now recognized so well. Return the page, or be ruined. It had been delivered anonymously without stamp, and Mrs. Graves declared she had found it slipped under the vestry door. Miss Marple took it up with mild curiosity. "Yes," she said softly. "The same hand that writes in books not its own." That evening she sat down with her notes. Ellen confirms. Mrs. Emery never used a recipe book. Book belonged to Mr. Jameson. Lavender scent. Letters and scraps in same spidery hand. Threatening note to vestry. Someone blackmailed Tom Innocent. Ellen convinced she underlined one line firmly. The recipe book is an account book. The last page, proof of theft. Miss Marple smiled faintly, setting aside her pencil. Forgery and theft, cloaked in the homely guise of sponge and chutney. Villages always dress their darkest deeds in the plainest clothes. And soon, she thought, someone in Willowbrook would try once more to dress murder in the homely folds of a recipe book. Chapter 10. The Missing Page. Inspector Graves was in high spirits. He had Tom Harcourt under lock in Marleycombe. The village seemed satisfied, and he believed his case nearly complete. But Miss Marple, seated quietly by Mrs. Wetherell's fireside, did not share his confidence. It was then that the vicar called unexpectedly, holding in his hand a folded sheet of paper. His face was pale, his voice lowered. "My dear ladies," he said, "this was pushed through the vestry door not 2 hours ago. It is very strange." He laid the sheet upon the table. It was a single page, torn raggedly at the edges, covered in the same spidery hand. Across the top were columns of figures, pounds, shillings, pence, and at the bottom, written more heavily, the words, "This page must be destroyed. If read, all is finished." Mrs. Wetherell gasped. "Accounts? Why, it's a ledger page." Miss Marple adjusted her spectacles. "Yes, and not just any. The last page of the so-called recipe book, I think. The very one someone wished to keep hidden." By morning, the discovery was on every lip in Willowbrook. Theories sprouted like mushrooms. Mrs. Price declared it proved Mrs. Emery had been stealing from the shop. Miss Prowse insisted it showed Mr. Harcourt's oven debt had ruined them all. The butcher's wife was certain it pointed to the vicar, for who else kept ledgers? Through it all, Inspector Graves puffed with importance. Proof of dishonesty plain as day. Young Harcourt must have known of it. He silenced Mrs. Emery before she could expose him. Miss Marple, however, shook her head gently. "No, Inspector, you are forgetting something." "What's that?" he demanded. "That Mrs. Emery collapsed before she tasted her cake, and that this writing is not hers. Someone planted the book, someone planted the page, to incriminate, not to confess." Graves muttered, unconvinced. Later that day, Miss Marple paid a visit to Mrs. Green, still weak in bed. She mentioned the page, and the woman's lips tightened. "I told her not to meddle," she whispered. "I told her the book was dangerous. But she said the last page proved who had been taking money. She meant to show it. And now look what has come of it." "Do you recall," Miss Marple asked softly, "who gave her the book?" Mrs. Green hesitated, then sighed. "It was Jameson. Always Jameson. He came from the solicitors, said he was helping with the accounts. But I mistrusted him. Too smooth. And his sister kept odd company, you know. A man from Marleycombe, fair-haired, always sniffing of lavender. I saw them once in the lane." Miss Marple nodded slowly. The pieces were fitting. The book, the forged hand, the lavender scent. Not Tom Harcourt, not poor bewildered Emery. No, someone far more careful and far more frightened of discovery. That evening she added to her notes, "Last page found. Accounts, not recipes. Not Mrs. Emery's hand. Jameson linked to book sister plus fair-haired man. Lavender. Page proves theft. motive for murder. And beneath she wrote, murder to silence discovery. Second attempt, Mrs. Green. Code same hand. Page cherched bait. She set down her pen, her expression grave. The page had not merely been torn from a book. It had been torn from a life, Mrs. Emery's, and others would follow if the truth were not uncovered. Miss Marple, who had spent a lifetime observing small deceits and petty cruelties, knew when deceit had grown into something monstrous, and she meant before long to expose the hand that had written in spidery ink the recipe for death. Chapter 11. A near-fatal mistake. Autumn settled more heavily on Willowbrook, the nights drawing in, the mornings crisp with mist. Yet the village was far from peaceful. Talk of ledger pages and poison lingered in every doorway. Tom Harcourt remained locked in Marleycombe, Inspector Graves more certain than ever of his case. And then, one chill evening, disaster was narrowly averted. It happened at the Women's Institute meeting. Mrs. Wetherill, indefatigable as always, had insisted that the monthly gathering go on. "We mustn't let ourselves be cowed," she declared, "by wickedness in our midst." The meeting began innocuously enough. Demonstrations of rug-making, a discussion on whether to hold a Christmas bazaar. Tea was served in the interval, steaming from the polished urns. It was during that bustle that the incident occurred. Mrs. Prowse, the postmistress, had just lifted her cup when Miss Marple, standing at her side, noticed the faintest shimmer upon the surface of the tea. Something crystalline. Not sugar. "Forgive me, my dear," Miss Marple said quickly, and with a deft hand she tipped the contents into a nearby flower vase. Within moments the leaves in the water shriveled, curling black at the edges. There was a gasp. The room erupted. Women clutched at one another. The urn was abandoned, and Inspector Graves, who happened to be present, basking in the attention of his supposed progress, leapt to his feet with a roar. "Who tampered with the tea?" he demanded. "Who had charge of the cups?" No one answered. The hall filled with murmurs, fearful and accusing. Miss Marple, however, looked serenely down at the vase. "Digitalis again," she murmured. "But not carelessly done. Someone wished to silence Mrs. Prowse in particular. She is too sharp with letters and envelopes, is she not? Perhaps she noticed something that was not meant to be seen." Mrs. Prowse, trembling, admitted she had indeed remarked upon the similarity between the handwriting on the anonymous notes and that on a bill lodged at the shop. "But I never thought—" Miss Marple smiled kindly. "The person who feared your thought was less charitable." That night Miss Marple returned to her notes. She wrote with neat precision. Attempt on Mrs. Prowse. Tea tampered. Digitalis again. Same hand. She remarked on handwriting similarity. Mistake. Attempt too public. Too hasty. And then more firmly. The killer grows reckless. Fear betrays neatness. She folded the page and set down her pen. Her face, calm as ever, was touched by a flicker of satisfaction. Murderers might be cunning, but human nature was their undoing. Fear, vanity, greed, impatience. And in Willowbrook someone had just betrayed themselves by one impulsive, nearly fatal mistake. Chapter 12. Miss Marple prepares the snare. The near poisoning at the Women's Institute left Willowbrook shaken to its core. Some declared they would never drink tea at a public gathering again. Others whispered that the devil himself must be at work in the village. Inspector Graves, red-faced, blustered that he was on the very brink of solving the case. Miss Marple, however, sat quietly by Mrs. Wetherill's fire, her knitting steady in her hands. She had seen the pattern clearly enough. Now it was only a matter of allowing the culprit to reveal themselves. The following morning she made a small round of visits, all under the most innocent of pretexts. At the grocer's she asked Ellen softly if she might borrow one of her mother's old recipe scraps. "For a seed cake," she explained. The girl, puzzled, obliged. The slip of paper she provided bore Mrs. Emery's round, practical hand, entirely unlike the spidery script of the so-called recipe book. At the vicarage, Miss Marple remarked to Mrs. Graves how very dangerous it was for letters to go astray, why anyone might slip something under the vestry door, and then how is one to know from whom it comes? Mrs. Graves, eager to confide, admitted she had found yet another note, this one warning, "Silence her, or the truth will out." She handed it over gladly, and at the hall, Miss Marple inquired after Mrs. Green, who was still weak. Mrs. Green whispered, "It was Jameson who gave me the bottle that last week. Said it was from the doctor. But I mistrusted him. Always lavender about him, and about that man who came with him once. Fair-haired fellow, a bad sort." That evening in her room, Miss Marple spread out her collection, scraps of notes, the torn ledger page, Ellen's recipe slip, the anonymous warnings. Side by side, the truth was plain. Mrs. Emery's handwriting, round and domestic. The ledger and threats, spidery, precise, forged. The lavender scent, a careless trail. Forgery, blackmail, and poison. Miss Marple murmured, "Not the work of hot-blooded youth or bewildered husbands. This is tidiness, the tidy cruelty of one who believes himself clever. And such cleverness will always overreach itself." She took up her notepaper and wrote, "Plan. Gather principal parties. Introduce a lost page, said to incriminate one person. Observe who cannot keep still." She folded the sheet and placed it carefully in her knitting basket. Tomorrow she would speak with Lady Fortescue of Willowbrook Hall. There would be a tea party, quite ordinary, quite innocent. And at that tea party the murderer would find themselves unable to resist. Miss Marple sat back, serene, her needles clicking once more. In her long life she had learned that truth, like weeds, will push up through the neatest flower bed. One only had to give it a little space, and it would show itself. And in Willowbrook, she thought, the truth was ready to bloom. Chapter 13. The gathering at Willowbrook Hall. Lady Fortescue of Willowbrook Hall, a widow of formidable presence and, it must be said, a certain relish for drama, was only too pleased to oblige Miss Marple's suggestion. A tea, she declared, would reassure the village, and show we are not defeated by wickedness. Invitations were issued with remarkable speed. Thus it was that 3 days later the drawing-room at the Hall was full. Silver teapots gleamed, lace napkins were laid, and the smell of fresh scones drifted in from the kitchens. Lady Fortescue presided, her rings flashing as she poured, while Inspector Graves hovered like a watchdog, stiff in his best uniform. The guests were carefully chosen. Mr. Emery, still pale but free for lack of proof. Young Ellen, timid at his side. Mrs. Green, carried down in a chair but insisting on attending. Mr. Jameson, the solicitor's clerk, his lips thin and eyes wary, and the fair-haired stranger, introduced as Mr. Latham, who lingered too close to Jameson for comfort. And in the corner, mild and unobtrusive, sat Miss Jane Marple, her needles clicking gently. The tea began with strained politeness. Sandwiches were passed, cups filled, small talk attempted. But the tension hung thick. It was Lady Fortescue, following Miss Marple's quiet prompting, who provided the spark. "Inspector," she said in her deep voice, "a curious thing happened yesterday. A note was delivered to the Hall, unsigned, of course. It claimed that the missing last page of the book has been found, and that it will be shown at the vestry tomorrow. I cannot think what it means, but no doubt you will know." At once the room changed. Mr. Emery blinked in bewilderment. Ellen caught her breath. Mrs. Green muttered a prayer, but it was on Jameson and Latham that Miss Marple's eyes rested. Jameson stiffened, colour draining from his cheeks. Latham's hand jerked sharply, spilling a few drops of tea upon his saucer. The inspector saw only a general unease, but Miss Marple noted the glance, swift, fearful, that passed between the two men. She bent her head over her knitting, her expression serene. The conversation stumbled on, but the unease grew. At last, unable to bear it, Jameson spoke. His voice was sharp, defensive. "Surely, Inspector, such anonymous threats mean nothing. Anyone might scribble a page and pretend it to be evidence. Dangerous to give weight to such nonsense. Indeed, murmured Miss Marple, her needle still. Yet I have always observed that only the guilty are truly afraid of nonsense. The innocent, Mr. Jameson, generally find it amusing. His mouth snapped shut. Latham shifted in his chair, his fair brows knitted. When the tea was concluded and the guests began to disperse, Inspector Graves turned to Miss Marple, scowling. "Well, ma'am, you seem to be watching them as if at a play. Did you see what you wished?" Miss Marple smiled gently. "Yes, Inspector. I saw men afraid of a page that has not even been shown. That tells us who fears its discovery. And fear, Inspector, is the clearest confession of all." Graves muttered, but said no more. That evening, in her quiet room, Miss Marple wrote, "Tea at Hall. Reaction observed. Jameson pale, Latham twitch. Guilty knowledge. Fear of last page proves connection. Inspector still blind." She underlined one final line. "Tomorrow they will betray themselves entirely." She folded the note and set it beside her knitting. The snare was laid. All that was needed now was patience, and Miss Marple had more patience than anyone in Willowbrook. Chapter 14. The Final Trap. The vestry at St. Michael's was crowded that next evening. Word had travelled quickly. A missing page of the mysterious recipe book had been found, and Inspector Graves intended to display it before witnesses. No villager would have missed it for the world. Candles flickered along the dark wood panelling, the air thick with whispers. Mrs. Green, bundled in shawls, sat grimly at the front. Lady Fortescue presided with stately composure. Mr. Emery and Ellen huddled together, pale but resolute. At one side stood Mr. Jameson, thin-lipped, his eyes darting. Beside him lingered Mr. Latham, fair-haired, restless, with the faintest trace of lavender clinging to his coat. And in a back pew, with her knitting bag neatly beside her, sat Miss Marple. Inspector Graves, puffed with self-importance, addressed the assembly. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have all suffered through this village scandal. Tonight we shall put an end to speculation. Here is the page that will decide the matter." He placed an envelope upon the vestry table. A hush fell. The envelope, however, was empty. Graves knew it, and Miss Marple knew it. But the villagers did not. The true purpose lay not in paper, but in people. For in the moment of silence that followed, Miss Marple's sharp eyes saw what she had expected. Jameson leaning forward, his face ashen, his hand half lifted. Latham swallowing hard, his knuckles whitening as he gripped the pew. Miss Marple rose, her voice soft but carrying clearly. "How very strange. Inspector, you have shown us nothing, and yet two gentlemen here look as though they have seen their doom. Why is that, I wonder?" All eyes turned. Jameson stammered, It is nonsense." "Is it?" Miss Marple's tone was gentle, almost pitying. "From the first, this crime has not been about recipes or domestic quarrels. It has been about accounts, forged accounts kept in a book disguised as harmless household notes. Mrs. Emery stumbled upon the truth, and for that she died. Mrs. Green nearly followed when she confirmed too much. Mrs. Prowse was nearly silenced too when she spoke of handwriting, and all the while someone feared the last page, because it proved who had stolen, who had forged, who had written the threats. The villagers gasped. Inspector Graves stared, caught off guard. Miss Marple turned her mild gaze upon Jameson. "You, sir, had the knowledge, the hand, and the axes. And you, Mr. Latham, were his accomplice, the messenger, the one who placed the letters, who carried the poison. Together you tried to turn suspicion first upon a husband, then upon a boy. But fear betrays you now, more clearly than any page." Jameson lurched to his feet, his face mottled. "Lies. She has no proof." But Latham betrayed him in that instant with a furious hiss. "Fool! You should have burned it all." The vestry erupted. Villagers shouted. Mrs. Green cried out. Ellen clutched her father's arm. Inspector Graves snapped into action, seizing both men by the shoulder with his constables. Miss Marple sat down quietly, her knitting once more in her lap. The trap had sprung. That night she noted the final lines in her book. Jameson such a forger, poisoner Latham, accomplice, courier fear of last page gave them away, and beneath, with the calm satisfaction of one who had seen human nature clearly, she wrote, "Murderers are tidy, but fear is untidy, and fear always shows." Chapter 15. The Explanation. The vestry had hardly settled. Jameson and Latham stood cornered between two constables, faces pale, mouths tight. Inspector Graves puffed himself up, but it was plain he was more startled than triumphant. The villagers, still buzzing with the shock of the capture, craned forward, hungry for detail. It was Miss Marple who supplied it, her voice soft but clear as she set aside her knitting. "My dear friends, I dislike confusion, and I think you deserve to know how these dreadful things came about." The room hushed. From the first I was troubled by two little matters. One, that Mrs. Emery collapsed before tasting her own cake, and two, that a recipe book lay upon the table which was never hers to begin with. That book was an account ledger, disguised, and in it someone had been recording thefts and shifting sums. The last page, which Mrs. Emery had discovered, proved everything. That is why it had to vanish, and why she had to vanish with it. Gasps murmured through the pews. Mr. Jameson, as clerk to the solicitor, had access to many accounts. He falsified them for his own profit, and used his sister and then Mr. Latham to help in moving funds and messages. Irene Jameson, poor girl, grew frightened and confided to Mrs. Emery. Mrs. Emery, practical and determined, wrote notes to herself in the book, and that sealed her fate. She was poisoned with digitalis, slipped into her tea before the judging began. She collapsed as the cake was cut, not from what she ate, but from what she had drunk beforehand. The book was placed beside her cake to make it appear her own. Neatness, you see. Too neat. Inspector Graves shifted uncomfortably. He had not thought of that. Mrs. Green, Miss Marple continued gently, was next. She knew too much about the bottle of drops, and so she was nearly silenced. Mrs. Prowse, too, because she noticed the handwriting. Each attempt was tidy, clever, but not quite clever enough. For tidiness in crime, I have often observed, is its own betrayal. She looked kindly but firmly at Jameson. You betrayed yourself when you blanched at mention of the last page, and you, Mr. Latham, when you could not hold your tongue. The vicar's wife whispered, "So simple," when explained. Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Yes, my dear. Most wickedness is, once one understands human nature. Greed, fear, envy, they are very old motives. One only has to watch how people look when they believe no one sees." Inspector Graves cleared his throat. Well, there we are. The law will take its course." But the villagers knew it was not the law that had solved the case. It was the quiet, sharp-eyed lady from St. Mary Mead, whose needles clicked while others shouted, and who had seen the truth all along. That night Miss Marple wrote her last entry in her notes. Mrs. Emery, silenced for discovering last page. Jameson, sent forger, poisoner Latham, accomplice, courier, other attempts, to protect secret pattern, tidiness betrayed by fear. She folded the paper, placed it with her knitting, and murmured, "One must always read the last page carefully. It is there the truth lies." Chapter 16. Aftermath. The storm passed quickly, as storms in English villages often do. Jameson and Latham were taken away to Marleycombe, and later to London, to stand trial. The villagers, shaken at first, soon found comfort in recounting their brush with crime to anyone who would listen. By the week's end, the harvest fair was remembered less for its charity stalls than for the murder that had taken place beside the recipe table. Mr. Emery, bewildered but relieved, reopened his shop. He looked thinner, sadder, but his hands were steady once more as he weighed sugar and wrapped parcels. Ellen, her colour returning, was seen walking out openly with young Tom Harcourt. The gossip that once would have condemned them now softened into sympathy. Mrs. Green recovered in time to resume her duties at Willowbrook Hall, though she crossed herself each time she passed the scullery where she had drunk the poisoned tea. The vicar preached a sermon on the dangers of covetousness and false witness, listened to gravely by some and with suppressed amusement by others. Miss Marple, her visit complete, prepared to return to St. Mary Mead. She sat with Mrs. Wetherill on the last evening, the fire glowing cheerfully in the grate. "My dear Jane," Mrs. Wetherill said, shaking her head, "how you ever managed to see through it all I shall never know. The inspector blustered, the village gossiped, and yet you with your knitting pieced it together." Miss Marple smiled. "It was not so very difficult. One notices small things, you know. A trembling hand, a too neat arrangement, fear where amusement ought to be. Murder is seldom as mysterious as it appears." Mrs. Wetherill sighed. "You make it sound as ordinary as baking a cake." "Ah, but it is not ordinary," Miss Marple said softly. "It is extraordinary wickedness concealed in the ordinary. That is why one must pay attention to the small details. They are where human nature shows itself most plainly." The next morning Miss Marple's bag was carried down to the coach. She stood for a moment at the garden gate, looking back at Willowbrook. The cottages neat beneath the autumn sun, the stream glinting beneath the bridge, the villagers calling cheerful greetings as though no darkness had touched their homes. Yet she knew, as she always did, that shadows linger, secrets fade into whispers, whispers into stories, and in time those stories become part of the fabric of village life. She smiled, adjusted her hat, and stepped into the coach. There would be roses to tend in St. Mary Mead, knitting to finish, and 1 or 2 teas to attend. And perhaps in some other village another puzzle would soon unfold. For wherever human nature dwells, Miss Marple thought, there will always be another last page to turn.